Hello, art historians, and welcome to our lecture over the art of Oceania. So this is going to be the last section of our unit over the art of imperialism. And just to kind of backtrack with you a little bit, in this unit, we have looked at areas of the world that really hadn't previously had a great deal of contact with the European continent, or basically with really a lot of people outside of that area, aside from trade. Now we're coming into a time where Europeans, especially after this industrial revolution, they are really going out in search of areas where they can have new resources, new markets, new workers, places that they can move workers out of their country if need be. And as a result of that, they're going to be interacting with places that they hadn't really interacted much with before. And we've already seen that with Africa. We saw that with the westward expansion in North America. And now we're going to look at how this is going to impact the people of Oceania, right? And the way that in this region, we can see the cultural traditions of Oceania and the way that those are going to be impacted by interactions with the Europeans. So first of all, it's really important that you understand when we're talking about Oceania, it's a really good clue when it has the word ocean in it. And we're talking about one of the oldest inhabited places in the world, all the way back to prehistoric times, after people moved out of Africa and were making their way across Asia. Eventually, they're going to make their way south. They're going to head south to these islands. You go past Indonesia and you start getting into these other areas. And when we're talking about that, this is a region that is very culturally distinct from what you will see in East Asia. So they're not really considered influenced by India or China or Japan or Korea to a great deal. And you're talking about even this vast area around the Pacific Rim, because it is such a huge region, is divided up into some little subsections. So you have Austronesia, you have Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia, all right? So you may have heard of some of these before, all right? So just to give you, Melanesia is gonna be north and east of Australia, which I'll show you these on a map in just a second. Micronesia, so small, is gonna be north and east of Melanesia, so it's even smaller areas. And then you have Polynesia, which is many, right? And that's going to be the areas that you probably recognize when you hear about Hawaii and Easter Island and areas like that. Now, we do know earlier in this year that we looked at the Lapita pottery shard, right? So we looked at this terracotta fragment that had these incised dots into it with the appearance of a human face that may have mimicked tattooing. And we do know that people in this area share a similar ancestry with that. And what was really cool about it is these people were very inventive, because you would have mixed this type of terracotta with sand to make it even more durable, because you're traveling between islands. You need it to be waterproof to store fresh water. If you've seen Moana, you know what I'm talking about. So we do know that based on some of the things that we've seen, for example, the importance of tattooing in these cultures, that they do share an ancestry with these early prehistoric people. And one of their earliest art forms was going to be pottery, for the simple fact that it was necessary. And that's not really new. We saw that when we talked about China. One of their earliest art forms is pottery. We saw that in Iran as well. So you have this seafaring culture that uses pottery to be able to transfer plants and animals and water as they travel between islands and islands and islands. And naturally, as people travel, their cultural will travel with them. But even if it's just a short distance between islands, the culture could be just a little bit different. So that's what we're going to look like. All right, so just to give you guys a visual of what we're talking about here. So you've got Austronesia, Melanesia, Micronesia. You guys can see the islands are pretty tiny, all right? And then Polynesia. And you can see these are actually pretty big regions when you consider just how big the Pacific Ocean is. And people don't usually realize how far away from the United States Hawaii is, but it's far enough to be lumped into this region as well. All right, so one of the big misconceptions, and I've discussed this with Africa before as well, is that when people arrived to areas like Africa or Oceania, they made this horrible, horrible mistake of thinking that different from their art means bad. And what I mean by that is the people of Oceania and Africa, as we have looked at, were not as concerned as Europeans with depicting things naturalistically. And remember, there's a big difference between naturalistically and realistically. I tell my kids that realistic means you could recognize it. You could look at it and go, oh, that's a human. It's not natural looking. That's not how humans naturally look, but that I can recognize realistically as a human. But these cultures that were early on presumed to be primitive, which kind of helped with the European narrative of imperialism and them going to help these, backwards places, is actually wrong because they weren't trying to make it look naturalistic. They didn't feel that they needed to. And one really, really good example of this is this Nukoro figure that is right here. And what they really believed is that there was in the oceanic culture, there is this spirit or life force called a mana, right? And a mana can be good or it can be evil. It's kind of like your energy, if you will. And that can be transferred between materials. It can be transferred between animals to humans. It can be transferred between humans to humans. And so therefore, this mana could inhabit these different objects or different people in different ways. So when you see this figurine, which really looks, very simple and would make Europeans think it was very primitive and backwards, it actually was deliberately stylized because these would be used at harvest times. And they were kind of, interchangeable basically. But notice that they are very smooth and very glossy. And if you know anything that we have studied this year, the more time that it takes to make something and to smooth it and really make it look nice, the more time that is put into it, or the more important the people, the more skilled they are in making it, the more important it is. And they would take and they would polish these with a pumice stone to make it very, very smooth and glossy. And then it was never meant to be an individualized person, just like we saw in African art, that those works of art were not intended to be to look like a specific person, with rare exceptions. It was meant to be the idea of something. And these local deities, these local gods, like during fertility festivals, they would take these little gods and then they would decorate them with things like feathers and beads. And that would identify the individuality in it, not the actual figure itself, right? So just something to point out, that just because it's not naturalistic like European art is, does not mean that it's primitive. There were some places in the world that just deliberately did not see the need to make something look exactly like a specific person. It was okay to just convey the idea of that at the time. All right, so again, here's another example of these. These have been found in quite a few areas in Micronesia. They could be made from mulberry or breadfruit trees, which could, be carved into these different subjects, or into these different little, these little gods here. And each one, right, could have a name, but it didn't really become that person until it was decorated. Now, here's another thing. They didn't feel that it was important to give these things earthly features because they weren't earthly. They were gods, right? And the gods didn't need all the trappings of humanity. So therefore, it wasn't, again, a big deal to them. So where Europeans are like, oh my gosh, look at them. They can't even do anything really advanced in sculpture. Well, they weren't trying to. They were using very simple lines to denote male, female, where the kneecaps are, like just the basic idea of a figure, because it wasn't the figure itself that was powerful. It was the spirit that it actually had. All right, so here's another couple of examples of that. All right, so you can see what they look like, right? Now, I think this is super cool because it influenced a artist that I'm a huge fan of, named Henry Moore, who was very influenced by the indigenous cultures that Europeans and Americans were encountering at this time. He really liked the Chocmool figures of Native America, but he also really liked these figures. And this really helped movements that were going on in America and Europe at the time, because after Impressionism, where there was this, okay, we have captured everything naturally to the point we can, like we've broken it down into color now, because there's cameras. A camera can get a natural picture of something exactly as it is. So it really freed artists up to be able to create works how they wanted to. So we see post-impressionists and we see symbolists, and we see them using color and form and line in ways that they want to, that aren't naturalistic. They are realistic, but not naturalistic. So now we start to see that in sculpture too. And Henry Moore was not trying to create a naturalistic depiction of a family or a woman. He was capturing the idea of that in its barest, simplest essence. And that's what we were seeing in African and Oceanic cultures. There's just a couple other sculptures by Henry Moore. I actually got a chance to go to Switzerland in 2019, and on one of my days off from work, I traveled down to their art museum, which was unfortunately closed because of a storm had broken a bunch of windows. But out in front of this old, museum in Geneva, Switzerland, there was an Henry Moore, and I really feel like it just spoke to the fact that I could recognize what it was and understand that feeling of what it was, even though I was in a different country. And I feel like that's what Henry Moore and these other artists who were becoming less concerned with naturalism were doing, is conveying universal ideas that spoke to everyone, especially in a time after World War I and after World War II, when people are really just feeling very disconnected as humans. And this could kind of recognize the shared humanity of all of us after such a really, really terrible time. By the way, if anybody's a fan of Clueless, all right, they actually have a Henry Moore in Clueless whenever they're out walking by the pool. It's Cher, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head right now, but he walks by this and he's like, transition, a very important piece. And yeah, it was kind of a really big deal. Never mind. If you haven't seen Clueless, forget it. It's a cult classic. All right, now another thing that's really important about this culture is the fact that they are a seafaring culture. If you've seen Moana, you know how important the sea and the ocean is to them, because it was essentially their survival, and traveling, across these islands and using pretty technical things to do it is pretty impressive, considering the massive scope that they traveled, not knowing if there's going to be another island for them to find. All right. So again, let's watch Moana. You'll get the whole thing. So the sea to them is very critical in terms of understanding it and being able to travel it. And I don't even really know if this should count as a work of art technically, but it's on the 250, so we're going to cover it anyway. And this is called a navigation chart from the Marshall Islands, which is in Micronesia. Now let's think about that. Micronesia, remember, if you looked at it, is a bunch of very, very tiny islands, which would be very, excuse me. Sorry about that, I was choking. Which would be very difficult to see sailing around, so that you'd have to definitely know how to get to these different areas. So these navigation charts were actually created as training aids for sailors. And one of the reasons why that's so important is for them to be able to find the way back to where they came from and to understand their knowledge of the sea as they had found it. So for this piece right here, you can see it's made of sticks that are hollow that could float. Why is that important? Because if it gets dropped over the side, you're going to be able to get it instead of it sinking, because this is essentially a map. So you have on it little tiny shells that could be marked as islands. You have wind currents and you have water currents. So the different lines could signify different things. So vertical could be the wind currents that come across it. The more curved lines could be the water currents underneath, so you know where the rip current is going to take you. So this would be kind of an early on navigational tool for these sailors who are going to be traveling across to these islands. Okay. All right, so when I show you guys this, when we're talking about the Marshall Islands up here in Micronesia, you're not talking about those really larger islands that are over this direction. These Marshall Islands in Micronesia are very, very tiny. So this is going to be very, very helpful to navigate within this area. Again, I don't consider this an art piece, but they're going to have it on there, so at least now you know what it is. All right, one thing that I really, really love about oceanic cultures, and especially in African cultures as well, is the idea of gender equality and the real importance of women to society. And there's really kind of this idea of what's called gender parallelism, which means that there's not one that's more important than another, but they work in roles that are parallel to each other, that are assigned to each gender, so that everything gets done. All right. So one of the things that is really cool is that the different media that is being used would determine who is going to work with it. So it's really kind of interesting that the men would work with the tougher materials. They would work with like the wood and any metal work like that. Women, on the other hand, are going to do the softer type of work. And that particularly is going to come down to bark cloth. For everybody who's going right now, wait, Shohorn, that didn't sound like it's very good for the women. It sounds like women are being given the easier job or the softer skills. Not true. Bark cloth, or tapa, is very difficult to make. It is extremely labor intensive. It also takes a great deal of skill to work with, because inside these mulberry trees, you would have to strip the inner lining of this bark. It would have to be soaked and then beaten until it was soft. Now, tapa, or this bark cloth, was a very important part of their culture, but it could also be elevated up to being even more important, because remember, the more difficult something is to make, the more importance it can have. We saw this with the jade Kong in China. It's going to be the same thing with the bark cloth. Now, the only way you can make the bark cloth even more impressive is with the patterns that are put on it. So if you see abstract patterns that are added onto this bark cloth, that takes even more time. So it's obviously very, very important if that is the case. This was such an important thing that it could also be used as currency, kind of the way that silk used to be. Like it was worth its value in money, basically. So this was prior to the arrival of cotton. This is what was used for clothing and everyday objects, but it also could be elevated up to an extremely high status because it was difficult to make. And my clip of Moana isn't going to work. But if you do watch this clip of Moana when they're singing Where You Are, you can see that they're actually beating some of the bark cloth at the same time. All right, so when we're talking about the bark cloth, people commonly associate the tapa or the bark cloth with New Zealand because it was actually brought there by Christian missionaries who had gotten it from other areas and brought it across. So it kind of bridged the gap. But just understand, we're talking about oceanic cultures. This bark cloth was a common thing, right? So you can see here, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but again, this obviously would be a very, very, very important piece of bark cloth that may be given as a gift. It may be given, used in funerals. It may be used to wrap around a god or something like that, because this was not only taking a long time to beat and to make it extremely soft. You can see these intense geometric patterns that are also very similar to some of the tattoo patterns that they had in this culture. But it's very similar in those abstract patterns, the way we would see on like the terracotta shards that we saw earlier this year. Right, so just to show you guys what the region that we're talking about here. So when we talk about Samoa and this region where they kind of focus on some of the more elaborate bark cloth, it's kind of right in that area. Now, this picture right here is actually very important because you can see that not only are the women are wearing the bark cloth with these very elaborate patterns, they're also presenting these Fiji mats, also having bark cloth with them. And they're presenting it actually to Queen Elizabeth. And this is actually really, really cool because Australia and Australasia and Fiji and in that area was considered part of the Australian Commonwealth. And not long after she married Prince Philip, she and Prince Philip went on a tour of these parts of the Commonwealth. And whenever they were there, because this was such an important person, they presented her with these bark cloths as a way to show her importance because she was being gifted these things. But not only that, it shows these women were important because they made these goods and they were the ones able and worthy to present them to her. All right, so this is just kind of a little bit more explanation than that. All right, so kind of already talked about it. All right, and I actually included this in an assignment, so I'm going to skip this video, but it actually is footage. Queen Elizabeth loved to take video. In fact, one of her wedding gifts was a camera that she got from her father. She loved to go and film things on her travels and on her honeymoon. And there's actually a lot of footage that was taken of memories of her traveling to these places. All right, now, this is evidence that within the Pacific cultures, just like we've seen in many other parts of the world, that there was a social hierarchy. And the more that you possessed something that was either rare or difficult to make or both, or if you could have specific skilled workers that's all they did was produce that you are powerful enough that you can say you are going to spend your entire day making this for me, then that would mean just by having that object, that it shows that you are powerful and you are worthy of having such a thing. Now, we've seen in other parts of the world that items of clothing could denote a person's status. We saw this with the Alta Kapu tunic that you guys learned about in the Inca society, that was meant to be worn by the Sapa Inca. And it was kind of, remember, like Girl Scout badges, like all the different squares could denote something about him or his achievements. We also saw this with the Aztec feather headdress, which was made of those feathers that there's only 2 per bird. So think about how many birds you had to kill to make that thing. We're also going to see this not far away from the Aztec and Inca cultures. We're going to see this in Polynesia as well, in Hawaii. And we're looking at this ahu'ula, which is a feather cape. Now, this picture is not showing it in detail just how massive this is, but these were extremely important objects that chiefs, so people of very high status, would wear in order to harness the mana or spirit. So they would be protected by these. So they're kind of cloaked in that, but at the same time, this is really important, in the animal world, all right, red and yellow signify danger. It's a warning, which is pretty common if you guys think of street lights. Yellow is warning you to slow down and red is telling you to stop, right, or warning you to quit. If a chief was wearing these, it signified his spiritual power, the protection surrounding him, and the power that he had. And you're talking about upwards of like 500,000 feathers, and the red and the yellow feathers used to create these were rare. And you had specialized workers who were meant to create these things specifically for this reason of making sure that this chief was protected, and also bringing in spirits of ancestors to do that. Now, what's really, really neat about these is that there's no 2 that were made the same. The geometric patterns that the red and the yellow create are almost like family crests that are significant to your family. All right, so kind of like family heritage of getting to wear this. If anybody has seen Scotland, how Scotland has all the different types of plaid, right? Even at Catholic schools, like there's all these different types of plaid. Like my daughter's is blue and white, right? That kind of signifies that you're part of the St. Paul family, or in Scotland, it's you're part of this clan because you're wearing this pattern of Argyle or whatever. This is the same thing. So they would take coconut fiber, again, watch Moana, the coconuts were very important, that you could weave fibers out of this and for nets and things like that. And then they would attach the feathers to them, right? I actually like the fact that they would keep the birds until they molted these feathers, so they weren't actually like killing the birds to get them. Maybe it's the idea that they could then go grow more feathers instead of, going extinct, and they'd never be able to make these. And then they would turn these into these massive capes and give them to these chiefs to wear. And sometimes as a gift, whenever European or American visitors came, they would give these gifts to sea captains to protect them on their journeys. But ultimately, this was a huge status symbol. All right. Now, I really think this is neat, that the crescent moon shape of this is very important, because it's like the crescent moon that casts darkness to ward off spirits and ghosts. And then there's the light of the yellow to bring shining bright light. All right, so it's this idea of that crescent moon, which has dark and light, that the darkness could keep the evil at bay and protect them, and then the yellow could bring light and understanding. All right. Unfortunately, as Christianity makes its way into this area, it's not unfortunate that Christianity made it there, that's not what I'm saying, but one of the things that's going to happen as Christianity becomes more of a dominant religion in this area, you're going to see these capes become more and more out of favor. Kind of like you see the Nkisi and Kandi from Africa that were the power figures. Those are going to go too because of the arrival of rival religious beliefs. All right, so here you can see just how big these would be. And you can see that each one has a distinct pattern to kind of signify the family lineage and who you belong to and who your loyalties were. All right, now, as we saw in the art of Africa, right, and in the Americas and in Europe, in fact, as long as religion has been around, there has been art that goes with it, because art makes those beliefs visible for believers so that they know this is what we believe, this is what we value, all right? It has been used for any number of things in terms of religion. Sometimes it's used to communicate with the ancestors or spirits. Remember, we saw this with the Scylla gold and jade crown, which they would wear on their heads, and then they could communicate with the spirits because of that. Sometimes it could be worshiping of a particular god. It could be used in the act of worship. So, for example, the Shiva is Lord of the Dance, all right? Sometimes it can be used to convey a very strong religious belief, especially regarding fertility, because fertility is very important to a lot of cultures, that the next generation is going to come along, there's going to be more workers, the civilization is going to continue. However, during this time, whenever you do see Europeans arrive to imperialize these areas, one thing that they're going to bring with them is Christianity. One, to convert them to it, and two, another, to pacify the people that they were conquering, which leads to, very commonly, works of art being destroyed in the name of religion, basically. All right, so a couple of objects that were very confusing to people who were Christian showing up, because they were part of the spiritual beliefs of these areas, all right? One of them is going to be the book masks, right? And I just think these are super cool because of the way that they were created. So these were actually created in the Torres Strait, all right? So the areas around that area, which is kind of a passageway between Australia and New Guinea. Now, it's not supposed to be turtles. That's where people get confused on this work of art. They use turtle shells to make it, but it's not supposed to be about a turtle. But if you're thinking about the spirit of the turtle and the fact that turtles can be on land and water, that could be a force behind this, all right? And since these are island cultures, it would make sense that a water and land animal would be very important, all right? Now, these book masks, all right, what they would do is you would have a human and an animal being portrayed, which is very similar to the transformation masks we saw over in the Pacific Northwest, all right? So that you see human and animal at the same time. So here you've got a human face that is on the turtle shell, or you can see the turtle shell underneath, which means it could be worn, like using the turtle shell as a hat. And then on top of it, you have a bird. Now, birds are a very significant part of a lot of these cultures. It's not just Oceania. There's a lot of cultures that value the bird because the bird can almost reach the heavens. It's almost a way of being able to communicate with the spirits that have gone before, which is such a huge thing that we see birds in all different types of pieces. For example, in the Yoruba veranda post, there is a bird on top of the king's head, kind of signifying the ability of females to communicate with the spirits because the senior wife is behind him and supporting him. So if you add on the bird, you have that ability to transcend this world and to go into the heavens. But then you also have put onto it fibers and feathers that were able to flutter and move, because what that does is it creates this sense of movement, that these things are actually alive and moving. And these book masks would be worn in a ceremony for male initiation rites. You're bringing in the hope that they're going to be blessed by the spirits, or funeral ceremonies to communicate with ancestors, to take the soul to the next life. And these would be worn by men, right, which we typically saw in Africa as well. And the movement, the rustling of the fibers and the movement of the feathers really creates this more lifelike appearance to the masks, making it almost come to life a little bit. All right, so here we go. There's actually a theory that sometimes if these were on here, that there was this beard, that it could potentially be the beard of an ancestor, because that would signify age and kind of wisdom, which we've seen in other cultures before. Remember in the Greeks, after Hadrian, he liked to have, or excuse me, the Roman Emperor Hadrian liked to have the beard of the Greeks because that basically meant that you were too busy thinking or being wise to shave. So there was this belief that it does have to do, especially with the bird, with connecting with ancestor spirits. Unfortunately, a lot of these were burned by Christian missionaries because they were involved with non-Christian practices. And a lot of these were collected by Europeans if they weren't destroyed. There's just another picture of it. You can really see that bird and the fibers that are right here, and then underneath that turtle shell. All right, so another religious figure that we have, I guarantee you guys have seen or heard of these before, is the Easter Island statues, all right, or the Moai. All right, so the Moai, that word actually means statues. And on Easter Island, there's more than 800 of these things. And they've actually done some really cool excavating lately where they've done some digging and found out that they actually have legs that go far underground for some of these. Now, here is where this is interesting, right? Because there was a lot of speculation on what these actually were for. So here is what we know, all right? They sit on volcanic rock, all right, on basalt, all right? And sometimes the platforms have ash mixed in with it. So that would have to do with cremation. So maybe there was this idea of transfer, you know, of spirits, or the ashes of the ancestors were helping the spirit inhabit these statues. What's really interesting about them is they're not faced out towards the sea on this island. They're actually positioned facing inward towards where the people would have been living, which means it's believed that their goal was to protect the people living on the land, not so much prevent against invasion on the outside. Their eyes would sometimes be inlaid like with red stone or coral, right, to kind of open them up, which is pretty impressive to give that kind of appearance. Okay, so you can notice that a lot of them have their chin almost kind of in a way tilted up. Like they're not really looking down at the ground, they're looking up, almost if they're like surveying, you know, all that is there, keeping an eye on everything. And on these platforms, you would have the ashes of the ancestors that are there too. So maybe that's what these were for. We don't actually have 100% because the people who created these disappeared. And it may actually have been how they created these and got them to their spot that got rid of the people who made them, which is kind of crazy. So in order to get these to the location, they would put them on logs, which they would roll, which means you obviously have to cut down trees to do it. And they may have actually deforested their land so badly building these that it may have run out the culture, very similar to what happened theoretically with the Maya. All right, so this is what I kind of talked about. They got rid of a lot of that volcanic soil to make these. The soil may have eroded because they cut down so many trees. So just kind of ironic, but that's why we don't 100% know. All we can go on is what we do know, that there's ashes buried here. They're facing inside, not outside. They're looking slightly upwards. All right, so it's probably some kind of religious function that they had. And this is just kind of cool. In 2015, they did some digging and found that some of these guys actually have bodies underneath, which is pretty interesting. All right, so this one's a fun one to teach. Can't wait to do this one. Okay, so in 1773, all right, you have the arrival of Captain James Cook, who was British, coming into these areas, which were named the Cook Islands. And when he got there, that is also going to be followed by the arrival of Christian missionaries. And the people who lived there decided to welcome them and present them with, you know, gifts. And when they showed up, they presented them with 14 of what we call staff gods. And if you look right down here, you can see these little gods that look like poles laying on the ground, all right? And the Christians who showed up were just aghast at these things, like, oh my God, like this is what you guys are bringing us. And they were like, yeah, this is our gods. This is a really important thing to us. And they were destroyed or they were altered because these were clearly related to the idea of fertility and regeneration and new birth based on the details that were on them. And some were taken back to Britain as anthropological objects, but most of them were destroyed because these guys were just like stunned that they would have this thing. And then the caption that was with this image was, and the idols he shall utterly abolish. So the Europeans came in ready and willing to knock these out. So this was, what they presented them with was called the Rarotonga staff god, all right? And this was an incredibly labor-intensive thing that these guys had to make. And they brought them 14 of them. Like, this is really, really important. And you can understand on an isolated culture and an island culture, continuation and reproduction of these people, especially these ancestral families, was really, really important. All right. So the staff gods of the Cook Islands, all right, that they had were presenting were about this creator god, Tangaroa. So it's this idea of, you know, creation. right? Which we know as grown-ups how babies and life are created, okay? And this object, this statue, if you will, greatly represented that. So you had this huge elongated body of this that was wrapped in lots and lots and lots of bark cloth. So that right there ought to tell you how important this is, because that's a great amount of bark cloth that has to be made to be wrapped around this in many different layers. And within the layers, they would place things like shells and different elements of the spirit. So, I mean, we're talking lots and lots and lots of these. Then at the top of it was a very small carved head. And into the head were some images of men and women, not together, but involved. I hate teaching this piece. I love it, but I hate it. Basically emphasizing their role in the creation aspect. All right, and I'll explain more in a second. All right, at the other end of it was a male phallus. All right, so one end is the head, and the other end is this phallus. All right, which is what got the British all shocked and shaken, like, oh my goodness. All right, so they wanted these destroyed, or at the very least, the phallus at the end had to be removed. And if you don't know what a phallus is, kids, ask somebody else, because I am not saying that on this video. All right. And again, this would have been showing not only in the carvings of the importance of men and women, but also in how this was made, that the men would have carved the body and the women would have made the bark cloth. So it's men and women and both of their importance in society. All right. So this is what it would have looked like. All right. Notice down here at the far left end that the phallus has been removed. And you can see the body with the large number of bark cloth that is wrapped around it, which would have held different charms and stuff within it. And then this is the head at the top. And along the spine, which is the support, you see women in the act of childbirth and their role in creation, and men with accentuated reproductive features that would have showed their role in creation. I really hope you guys are picking up what I'm putting down here, right? But you can understand why the British, whenever they got a hold of this, were like, we can't have that. We're going to have to do something about it. All right. But despite the fact that some of these Europeans got all shocked and shaken about some of the things that they saw and the cultures that they encountered, there was a huge demand in Europe for images and artworks and pictures of the cultures that they couldn't see. Remember, there's no TV yet. You're hearing about all these cultures, but at no point yet is there any way for just the average person to see it. So there is going to be a good market for someone if they wanted to get into the business of creating, let's say, paintings of the people within these cultures. All right, so a really good example that we're going to look at is a portrait of a Maori chief in New Zealand who lived through the arrival of the British, and his name was Tamati Waikane. All right, this guy was baptized into a branch of the Christian faith. He was Wesleyan, and he became very absorbed into the new European culture. This is going to create a really strange thing, all right, because Europeans wanted to see native people, indigenous people, in their indigenous dress. But there were quite a few people in Oceania who wanted to have their pictures done in European clothing or European hats. It was very, very backwards. All right. So instead of the Europeans wanting to see the Oceanic people in European, they wanted to see them as they actually were. And on the other side of it, you have the people of Oceania who wanted to have their portraits done in European clothing, right? Now, these portraits are extremely important because in Oceania, Maori people believe that a picture of a person just wasn't of them, it was them. So kind of like we saw in Korea with the portrait of Sin Suk Ju, like these were not just to be looked at, like, oh, there's grandpa. It's supposed to be used in the act of honoring or revering them, especially as ancestors, all right? Kind of like their soul could inhabit this portrait of a way, all right? And the Maori people were fascinated by the ability to create pictures and paintings. But one of the problems with doing this with pictures is you were leaving out those pictures. Early photographs could not really capture one of the most important parts of Maori culture, and that is their tattoos. So on the other hand, by doing portrait painting, like with oil paints, you could still capture that very important part of their identity, especially the maka right here, the mana, right? So again, there's a huge demand for these portraits on both sides of the ocean. So you get Gottfried Lindauer, who was Czechoslovakian. He's trained in European classical art. He's very good with oil paints and creating a naturalistic appearance. Studies in Europe and heads over to this area, to New Zealand, and starts painting portraits that were in huge demand, again, on both sides of the ocean. All right, so this is where it gets really backwards. Okay, so again, the middle one, you have a Maori man with his tattoos dressed in European clothing. That would have been for somebody from Oceania. The two on the sides with the massive amount of tattoos and the kiwi feathers and the jade and all of these really important natural materials that were native to that area, that's what Europe wanted to see. They wanted to see those types of paintings. All right. So what Lindauer does is, this is Tamati Wakanene, right? And this was done for European patrons for them to see him. And notice that he puts him in, he emphasizes his tattoos, which oil paint could do and a photograph could not do. European oil paint, right? Very, very clear there that he's using that oil to create those textures. You can even see the grains of the staff that he's holding. The kiwi feathers could actually take on the mana of that kiwi, or of that bird, and surround this person, kind of giving him that power as well. Same thing as we saw with the Ahu'ula cape. You've got coconut fibers, you've got bark cloth, you have this jade earring, you have this green eye in the middle of the staff, and then these massive amounts of line that accentuates those tattoos. And this would have been, using that oil paint, he could really bring this to life for people who, in Europe, who wanted to see them in native dress, not so much, to see natives in European clothing. All right, and again, this is not really, it's kind of like with the Ka statues that we saw in Egypt. Like, this was a portrait not just to be looked at. This had power to the Maori. Like, it kind of harnessed, a spirit of them as an ancestor. All right. Tamati Wakanene actually died 3 years before this work was painted. We have no idea how he would have actually felt about it. Tamati Wakanene, if he was, especially since he converted to Christianity, most likely would have wanted to be shown in European clothing. But because this was there was a photograph of this chief, or of this man, who had these beautiful, exquisite tattoos. Gottfried Lindauer painted this image of him in oil paints and then took it back over to Europe, right? So he included all of these elements and really used that oil paint to show the textures of them, of the kiwi feathers and the emerald and the jade, the staff with the eye in the centers, and especially the tattoos, because the more important your status was in these Polynesian cultures, the more tattoos that you had. All right. So we are going to stop there, and I'm going to pick up this lecture with Oceanic Art Part 2.